I'm an anthropologist. And as an anthropologist, we talk about the myth of barter. In a way, it's a pet peeve we have with economists, because 200 years ago, Adam Smith wrote a story about the origins of money. He was speculating. He didn't know. But he thought, well, once upon a time, there must have been people who had too much of one thing and wanted another. Here's two American Indians, and one says to the other, I'll give you 25 arrowheads for that beaver pelt. Maybe 30, okay? 2 beaver pelts. So they negotiate, and this is how economics worked. I'll give you 20 chickens for that cow, so forth. Eventually this became inconvenient. They had to invent money. Credit systems emerged later after that. It was a kind of evolutionary chain. You go from barter to money to credit to securitized derivatives. The same thing. The problem is, for 200 years, anthropologists have been looking for any place where people say, I'll give you 25 arrowheads for that beaver pelt. It doesn't happen, ever. Which is surprising, because there's really not many things that nobody ever does. But this is one. Yet, for some reason, the economists won't change the story, now that they know it's false. It obviously is doing some kind of ideological work for them. And I think what that work is, first of all, it's creating the possibility of economics itself. The reason, if you think about the story, it's absurd. The reason it's absurd is because it assumes that a group of Neolithic villagers are going to be operating entirely on what economists call the spot trade. I'll give you this, you give me that, we walk away. They'll never use credit. Well, why not? They're neighbors. If I want your cow and you don't want my chickens, well, I'm going to have something you want eventually. We're neighbors. And it's nice to have neighbors in your town. In fact, what happens is when you look at communities that don't use money, is everybody owes something to everybody else. People keep track, and if somebody gives you something back that isn't worth much, you might make fun of them, but you're unlikely to come up with a mathematical formula for exactly how cheap you thought they were. The question becomes, well, money, how does that happen? Money means being able to say exactly how many chickens equals one cow. In fact, the answer is, it happens when people are very angry. If, say, you are mocking me as a cheapskate, people start pulling out weapons and somebody's ear gets cut off, well, then there's very, very specific numbers for how many chickens you should pay. In fact, if you look at law codes of stateless societies, they don't have markets, but they do have very, very complex systems of fines and penalties. So it's in a situation where violence may ensue that people become exact. And it will say, if you cut off someone's ear, that's 20 young cows. And if you don't have cows, well, then you do have to figure out what to substitute. And nobody is in a mood to compromise. So it's exactly those situations of potential violence that people become exact and that money emerges. And that connection between money and violence holds true throughout human history. And one thing which fascinates me about the history of debt is that, well, a debt is simply a promise. It's all it is. Now, in a way, a promise is a very beautiful and sacred thing. The essence of human freedom is the ability to make promises. The word free, in English, goes back to the same root as the word for friend, because slaves cannot make promises and make friends. Only free people can make commitments to one another. But a debt is a very peculiar type of promise, because it's, as I put it, a promise that has been corrupted by a combination of math and violence. So it can become something impersonal and something transferable. However, when you are dealing with social equals, it's really just a promise. One finds that among poor people when they lend each other money. When I lend money to my brother, perhaps, it's partly, I might want to give it to him and I just want him not to be embarrassed.